Imagine a man so dangerous that he was hunted by every constable in France, only to become the man who invented the modern police force. This is the story of Eugène François Vidocq, a thief, a brawler, and a master of disguise, who realized that to catch a wolf, you need a wolf who knows the forest. To understand the man, we have to look at the world that forged him. France, in the late 18th century, was a powder keg of revolution, poverty, and absolute lawlessness. In the city of Arras in 1775, a boy was born who would eventually terrify and then save the streets of Paris. Eugène François Vidocq was the son of a baker, but he didn't have the temperament for kneading dough. He was built for conflict. By the age of 14, he had already accidentally killed his fencing instructor in a duel and stolen a fortune in silver plates from his own parents. His youth was a whirlwind of violence and narrow escapes. He fled his hometown, joined the army, and fought in the battles of Valmy and Jemappes. But the discipline of military life couldn't hold him. He was a man of the shadows, a man who lived by his wits and his fists. He deserted, rejoined under a false name, and deserted again. He spent years bouncing between the army and the underworld, a cycle of duels, scams, and short-lived romances that usually ended in a brawl. But the real turning point came when Vidocq was sent to the bagne of Toulon. In those days, the French penal system was a living nightmare. The bagne was a galley prison where men were chained to oars or forced into back-breaking labor until they died. It was a place designed to break the human spirit. But for Vidocq, it was a finishing school. It was here that he learned the language of the underworld, the secret codes of thieves, and the psychology of the professional criminal. He also became the greatest escape artist France had ever seen. He escaped from the bagne multiple times, often using incredible disguises. Once, he walked out of the prison gates dressed as a sailor. Another time, he escaped while disguised as a nun. He was a chameleon, a man who could change his gait, his voice, and his very identity in a matter of seconds. But every time he escaped, the law eventually caught up with him. He was a man without a home, a ghost in his own country, constantly looking over his shoulder. By 1809, Vidocq was 34 years old and exhausted. He realized that as long as he stayed on the wrong side of the law, he would never be free. He made a radical, desperate decision. He contacted the Paris police and offered them a deal. He told them that he knew the underworld better than any detective ever could. He knew where the gangs hid, how they planned their heists, and who their fences were. He offered to become an informant in exchange for his freedom. The police were skeptical. Why trust a convicted felon? But the crime rate in Paris was spiraling out of control, and they were desperate. They placed Vidocq in the forced prison as a secret agent. His job was to listen. He spent his days in the yards and his nights in the cells, soaking up every confession and every whispered plan. The information he provided was so accurate and so devastatingly effective that the police realized they had found something more than just an informant. They had found a weapon. In 1812, Vidocq was formally pardoned and allowed to form a new experimental unit, the Brigade de Sûreté. This was the birth of the first undercover police force in history. Vidocq's philosophy was simple but revolutionary: set a thief to catch a thief. He didn't hire career soldiers or bureaucrats. He hired former criminals. He looked for men who had been to the galleys, men who knew the faces of every career criminal in Paris. The Sûreté started with only 4 men, but their impact was immediate and staggering. In their first year, this tiny group of ex-convicts made over 800 arrests. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't walk predictable beats. They moved through the slums and the taverns as if they belonged there, because they did. They were ghosts among ghosts. Vidocq didn't just rely on his men's street smarts, he essentially invented the science of criminology. Before Vidocq, policing was mostly about brute force or luck. Vidocq brought logic and method to the chaos. He was the first to create a comprehensive filing system for criminals. He kept records of every criminal's physical appearance, their preferred method of operation, and their known associates. He created a museum of criminal tools, studying how different lockpicks worked so his men could identify which burglar had been at a crime scene just by looking at the scratches on a door.
He was a pioneer of forensic science. He was the first to use plaster of Paris to take casts of footprints found at crime scenes. He understood that a man's gait was as unique as his face. He also experimented with ballistics. In one famous case, he proved a man's innocence by showing that the bullet removed from a victim didn't match the caliber of the suspect's pistol. This was decades before ballistics would become a standard part of police work.
Vidocq was also a master of the sting operation. He would often go undercover himself, spending weeks living in a cellar or a flophouse to infiltrate a gang. He would adopt a persona, a crooked businessman, a simple-minded laborer, or an escaped convict, and he would play the part so perfectly that even his own men wouldn't recognize him. He once spent 3 days in a prison cell with a notorious murderer just to get him to reveal the location of his hidden loot. By the time the murderer realized he'd been played, he was already on his way to the guillotine.
But his success made him enemies. The regular police, the gendarmerie, loathed him. They saw him as a common criminal who had usurped their authority. They hated his methods, they hated his results, and they hated that the public saw him as a hero. There were constant attempts to frame him or discredit the Sûreté. In 1827, feeling the weight of political pressure and internal jealousy, Vidocq resigned from the Sûreté. But he wasn't done. He was a man who couldn't stay still. He attempted to start a paper mill that employed only ex-convicts, a noble social experiment that ultimately failed because the public was too afraid to buy products made by criminals. When that failed, he pivoted again and founded the world's first private detective agency, Le Bureau de Renseignement. This was the blueprint for every private eye agency that has existed since. He hired agents to track down missing persons, investigate marital infidelities, and recover stolen property for a fee. He was essentially the first private eye, a title that originated from his agency's logo, a wide open eye with the motto, "I never sleep." His influence didn't just stay on the streets, it leaked into the very fabric of world literature. Vidocq was a close friend of Victor Hugo and Honoré de Balzac. When Hugo was writing Les Miserables, he used Vidocq as the inspiration for both of his main characters. Jean Valjean, the escaped convict seeking redemption, was based on Vidocq's early life. Inspector Javert, the relentless, cold-blooded hunter of men, was based on Vidocq's later years as the head of the Sûreté. It's a fascinating irony. The same man inspired both the hero and the antagonist of one of history's greatest novels. Edgar Allan Poe was also deeply influenced by Vidocq's memoirs. When Poe created C. Auguste Dupin, the world's first fictional detective, he drew directly from Vidocq's analytical methods and his use of logic to solve seemingly impossible crimes. Without Vidocq, we might never have had Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, or any of the iconic detectives that dominate our culture today. Vidocq's later years were a mix of grand successes and crushing setbacks. He was constantly involved in lawsuits, often brought by the government that still viewed him with suspicion. He lived through multiple revolutions, always adapting, always surviving. Even in his 70s, he was still active, still investigating, and still a figure of immense mystery. He passed away in 1857 at the age of 81. He died in his own bed, a far cry from the cold stone floors of the Bang where he began. He left behind a world that was fundamentally changed. The Sûreté Nationale, which he founded, would go on to become the template for the FBI and Scotland Yard. His innovations in forensics and undercover work remain the backbone of modern law enforcement.
Eugène François Vidocq was a man of contradictions. He was a thief who valued justice, a liar who sought the truth, and an outlaw who became the law. He proved that a man's past does not have to define his future, and that sometimes the best way to protect society is to understand the very people who threaten it. He was the criminal genius who built the walls that keep the modern world safe.
If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe.